Good morning. Welcome to the Tuesday, September 15th meeting of the Safe Communities Committee. As always, the last couple of meetings, we've got a long agenda, and so we want to get into it. We've also got some good news we're going to lead off with early in our agenda today that I'm very excited about from Chief Jennings. Well, first, as usual, we will start out with introductions, starting with the folks sitting here in the room, going to committee members joining us virtually, and then staff joining us virtually in that order. So,
Ryan Bergman, Strategy and Budget Director.
Federico Rios, Assistant Director, Office of Equity, Mobility, and Immigrant Integration.
Johnny Jennings, Chief of Police.
Marcus Jones, City Manager.
Larkin Eggleston, Committee Chair.
Renata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
James Mitchell, Vice Chair.
Patrick Baker, City Attorney.
Maureen Harris, Strategy and Budget.
Other committee members and then other council members that are joining us virtually.
Malcolm Graham, City Council District 2.
Renee, City Council District 4 and committee member.
Ed Driggs, District 7.
Dimple Ashmurda, committee member.
Julie Eisel, Mayor Pro Tem and at large.
Braxton Winston at large.
I believe I see our mayor on as well. She might have stepped away, but Mayor Val Lyles is joining us. I know council member and committee member Victoria Watlington will be joining us. Will be a few minutes late, coming from another meeting. And what other staff do we have on the line virtually?
Good morning, Jessica Battle, Police Attorney's Office.
Good morning, Lacey Williams with the Equity Office.
And I believe we have one member at least of our community input group as well.
Yes, sir. Ryan McGill with subgroup 4.
Have I omitted anybody in introductions? All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. The goal today, we've got a lot of topics we're going to cover, and as we've discussed previously, on October 5th at the full council strategy session, we are going to, as a committee, bring forward a whole slate of recommendations based on the work that we've done over the last couple of months. And so, as you'll see at the bottom of your agenda for our next meeting on September 29th, among other things, we're going to leave a significant amount of time on the 29th at that meeting for the bottom bullet point there, committee considerations of initial recommendations. So the goal today is to get as much information and ask as many questions as we need to on the topics on the agenda, and then have a holistic discussion 2 weeks from today on the recommendations that we want to put forward to the full council on October 5th. So there'll certainly be time for additional information gathering on the 29th, but I'm hoping that we've got as close to all the information we need coming out of this meeting and going into the one 2 weeks from now, so that we don't have to do too much information gathering on the 29th, but as a committee can discuss, based on everything that we've been given, what we see as the next steps for the full council to consider in October. So I will try to keep us on task on the specific agenda items today. And then I think on the 29th, if there's anything that we want to go back to that might have been other subject matter we've covered in previous meetings, we can kind of pull anything back on the 29th, because we'll be discussing recommendations based on the entire information set we've been given over the last however many meetings it's been the past few months. So I think anything will be in order on the 29th, even if it's not specifically on the agenda. But today I do want to try to make sure we're staying focused on the agenda as you see it in front of you. So with that, I'll get the city manager to lead us off with an overview of the agenda. We'll get some feedback based on some questions from the last meeting from Mr. Bergman, and then an update from the community input group from Mr. Rios before we move on to some good news announcements.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. and members of the committee. As the chair has mentioned, we have Ryan Bergman here, the budget director, and he'll discuss some of the information or the analysis that has been happening across some of the different committees. We'll have the update from the community input group, as well as 8 Can't Wait. And then we'll have a continued discussion with CMPD directives on passive protests and peaceful demonstrations and First Amendment activities, a review of police transparency and access to information, and we'll discuss the next steps. I do want to always give you a little bit of an update as it relates to violence prevention. So as council knows, we've already engaged with Cure Violence. They are actually beginning interviews within the community, so we're very pleased with where we have there, as well as we are in the final stages of our agreement with the hospitalization emergency room interrupter also, so we're very pleased with that. One thing before...
Mr. Manager, on that note, for community members that want to be involved in the Cure Violence interviews and research and data collection that they're doing, have we put out on the city channels ways for people to engage with that work?
Yes.
How can people engage with that work if they're wanting to?
Well, let's, Mr. Chair, I think the first thing is we've worked within the community to get a list of individuals who should be interviewed, and as we start through that interview process, more names will come up. But as we discussed, not this last council meeting, but the council meeting before that, it's important to get the process started with some of the folks who have been identified as influencers, and then more people will be identified through that process. One of the things that I would like to reiterate is that through the various council committees and to the vice chair of this committee, but the chair of Workforce and Business Development, there have been these other discussions for this new Safe Charlotte focus, and I believe, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, that you had that discussion yesterday, or at least began the discussion, so that 12 referrals that are out there that I believe are going to help inform the city of how we move forward. I've asked Ryan to come today because there are a number of referrals that have been in the Budget and Effectiveness Committee, and the Budget and Effectiveness Committee has been briefed on some of the data that's out there, and I think it's important to bring that forward to the Safe Communities Committee, as well as some of the efforts that the Budget Office is doing from a policy perspective to get data from you, anywhere from analyzing 911 calls to looking at other structures throughout the country. So if we could just give Ryan a little bit of time to give us an update with that, I think it would be helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Manager, and I'll be conscientious of time here. There's 3 quick things I wanted to go over. The first was a request from this meeting a couple of weeks ago on the review of police oversight, police accountability offices that were throughout the country. Fortunately, the manager had requested of the budget office last month to begin reviewing some of these throughout the country as part of our internal work. So we were relatively far along. We looked at Austin, Kansas City, Seattle, with Austin maybe the best comparison due to size and the type of government. But we were able to produce a pretty comprehensive report that Lauren Ruvalcaba, senior analyst in our staff, headed up. We plan to release that by the end of the day. It's about 25 pages with a lot of information and analysis. We were able to connect with each of these cities, so you should have that for your review later on today. The second thing I wanted to mention was another internal assignment that we had gotten from the city manager a month or 2 ago to go down the path of 911 calls, how we dispatch officers, and review and benchmark throughout the country what other cities are doing. And I know some of that work has started to be done here. We've looked at some pretty detailed and comprehensive approaches throughout the country. Some that come to mind would be Eugene, which has what's called a CAHOOTS program. There's also a STAR program in Denver. Albuquerque has an approach similar to that. And basically the way these work is there's an assessment of risk for calls, specifically around homelessness, mental health. And with that assessment of risk, there's a civilian-led approach to try to address these calls prior to going to public safety. And it seems to be programs that have had support from police as well as from the community in these other places. So we'll continue to go down that path. We'll continue to do the work on that for future review in this committee, budget committee, wherever we like to take it. But I did want to get that out there. And then finally, on the manager's point on the budget committee, I won't talk about the violence prevention dashboard, which was brought to full council, but I will talk a little bit about what else we do. And I see Chairman Driggs is on the call as well. I had given what I'll call a visual tool presentation for how to read and understand public safety, the police's budget. And what you get to is once you account for things like school resource officers and the airport, which are fully reimbursed, you end up with about a $257 million operating budget. 87% of that is salaries, benefits, and insurance. So that's where the most money is with the police budget. But the presentation also went beyond that, and it took what was remaining of non-personnel, and we broke it into categories. And the committee had a very clear focus on wanting to know more about equipment purchases, like department-specific equipment purchases, think weapons, tasers, things of that nature. And so what we did is we worked with finance, and for FY20, which ended June 30th, we downloaded all of the purchases above $1,000 that were made by CMPD, and there's 420 of them. We turned it over to Chief Jennings and his staff, and we asked if he could provide a public description of what we're buying and what it is for. And their staff did that work quickly and thoroughly, and we actually will release that to the Budget Committee later today. I hope that it's seen as a good step of what we can do, what we can provide. Beyond that, CMPD will also be there, Deputy Chief Voorhees, to talk about staffing analysis, overtime, and asset management. So there's kind of a coordination between these two groups, which I think is happening and needs to happen, and that's why the manager had asked me to talk a little bit. But with that, I'll turn it back over to him.
So, Mr. Chair and Mr. Vice Chair, I foresee that this is the beginning of sharing some of this information that's happening between committees. I think that's important because sometimes a question may come up in a committee in this area that's already been addressed by another committee. So I will own that to make sure that we are providing you I know it comes out Thursdays, but sometimes if we don't identify it or flag it, it may get lost in some other things. So just wanted to have Ryan here briefly. I know he's going to leave to get prepared for the Budget and Effectiveness Committee, but I wanted to share that with the committee today, Mr. Chair. And with that said, I would then turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bergman. A lot of us will be seeing you in a couple hours. Mr. Rios, if you will, give us an update on the work of the Community Input Group.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. A few items before we kick off. Just wanted to share again that we had moved our meetings, so we did not have a meeting with the Community Input Group last week. We had done so again to allow for more time to produce as good a policy framework recommendation as possible. And I'm proud to say that we did an incredible job. This group put together some really great recommendations. And just to give you an overview, we provided 5 different articles, 1 research paper, documents from the federal government, CMPD directive guides on peaceful protests and First Amendment activities. We compiled all of that and shared that with the committee. So over a 2-week span, they were able to review those documents. Shared that with the Community Input Group. They were able to review those documents. And so it was a great deal of work done during those 2 weeks in spite of the fact that we did not meet via Zoom. I also wanted to thank Councilmember Johnson for connecting us with Dr. Rahini Har from Berkeley Public Health, who provided the community input group with fact sheets on crowd control weapons and social protest, as well as kinetic impact projectiles. Those were also reviewed by the group. Just want to thank Ryan McGill. I know that he's on the call. Ryan was able to step in on short notice. The other members of Group 4 were not available for today's call, but Ryan thankfully was. And so Ryan will be presenting. After Ryan presents, I will go over additional documents that were shared by members of the committee that were not a part of Group 4. So Ryan will go over Group 4's document in addition to the document that was produced over their Zoom call and their subsequent meetings. Kaz Otley, who's also a member of Group 4, sent in some information that he'll be sharing. And then I'll go over some additional documents sent by other members of the group. And then lastly, Ryan Bergman just shared that that you all have some documents related to Cahoots and STAR, and we will be reviewing those two programs in addition to some other things that have occurred that are similar to those programs here in the state of North Carolina at our next community input group meeting scheduled for this Thursday.
Thank you. And one of the things that I'll put a bug in the ear of the committee members and council members now that I think we'll need to consider 2 weeks from now on the 29th. As I said, we'll be putting forward a whole set of recommendations to the full council. We'll discuss those recommendations on the 29th. We'll put them forward to the council on the 5th and proceed through our standard procedure of having a public hearing, voting on them thereafter. I think one of the things we need to consider is as we sort of transition back to not only the focus we've had of late on some of the reimagining the police work, but also violence as a public health crisis and the other things that the Safe Communities Committee is charged with focusing on. I think we need to consider, and obviously this would be pending the members of the community input group's willingness and availability to do so, but what role can that group play going forward, and how do we want to engage them beyond just the work we've tasked them with doing now? I don't have an answer in mind, but I think it's something that we all ought to be thinking about and that we ought to probably anticipate discussing on the 29th. But I'm grateful for the work they've done so far and will continue to do. And I know we'll hear from Mr. McGill when we get to agenda item 4 on some of the feedback from the community input group and the subgroup specifically that had been focusing on passive protest, peaceful demonstration. So with that, we'll get to some good news from Chief Jennings in terms of an update on CMPD practices and their alignment with the 8 Can't Wait initiative.
And Mr. Chair, before the good news comes, Federico has the link where people can sign up as it relates to Cure Violence.
Anyone that's interested in participating in the information sessions related to Cure Violence can link to cltgov.me/cure violence. Again, that's cltgov.me/cure violence to sign up for those information sessions.
And whoever's running our city Facebook page live stream of this meeting, if they can drop that link into the comments section of the Facebook live stream, I think that would be helpful as well. Please and thank you. Chief Jennings?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. As everyone knows, we've been working with the 8 Can't Wait initiative for several months. Several weeks ago, I wasn't really optimistic that we would get there as far as meeting the criteria for all 8. I'm happy to announce that today, just as recently as a few days ago, that we have met every initiative with the 8 Can't Wait, and that we have been signed off on being in compliance with all 8 based on some policy changes, and that website, their website, will be updated within the next couple of weeks. But the 2 that were of the most challenging were one was the ban on shooting at moving vehicles, and then the other was required to exhaust all alternatives before shooting. After a lot of back and forth, I think both groups had a really good piece of education through all this. We learned a lot from each other, We were able to talk through some of the most important pieces of the wording that needed to go into the policy, and we have come to agreements that for policies that work for both sides, and we are now officially in compliant with all of the 8 can't wait talking points. So very pleased to announce that. And, we still always looking at ways that we can improve and get better. So this is a good start for CMPD.
Thank you, Chief. I was trying to look to see, the last time I looked, and I can't find it quickly, so I'll find it later. But, I hope this doesn't go unrecognized, because there are very few cities in terms of anything that would be considered a peer city of our size that have met all 8 of these points in the 8 Can't Wait initiative from Campaign Zero. And the fact that we were at 3 moving towards 4 3 months ago and have now gotten sign off from Campaign Zero that our new policies will be in compliance with all 8 is significant. And I hope that I appreciate everybody, the entire council, every member of council and the mayor being supportive of our pursuing this. And I'm grateful for the fact that the chief was a willing partner in trying to help us align our policies with these best practices. So I see that, and Ms. Ajmer, I apologize if this was on an earlier topic. I don't know if, but I'm just now seeing your hand. Did you have a question about this or something else that we had already touched on?
Yes, I had a question on input group. So will input group get to CMPD budget before September 29th?
I'm going to need you to explain what you mean get to the budget. Will they have a chance to discuss the budget?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Rios, do you know what all you have on the docket upcoming for the community input group?
So we have, as I mentioned, we have the mental health presentation. We will allot the remaining topics to the subgroups to go through an analysis. I hope to be able to get through the budget piece, but we may need an additional week to do so.
If that could be, to Ms. Ajmer's point on the timing, I'm going to pull up a calendar now. Would it be possible, you said you're meeting this week. So could there maybe be consideration, and there's obviously something you'd have to discuss with the members of the community input group, if needed, could there be consideration of meeting 2 weeks in a row so that information could all be covered before the meeting on the 29th? Because as Ms. Ajmer was getting at there, if we are putting forward recommendations as a committee on the 29th, we'll need all the information we can get. We'll need it all before then. And so if the community input group didn't meet again until the 1st, we would have already voted as a committee on the recommendations and wouldn't have the benefit of having their feedback.
I will propose it to them. I don't foresee there being much of a challenge. It may not be the entire group, but we can get as many members to review it as possible.
Yeah, so any and everything that can be done in that group and provided to this committee as feedback on the 29th, I think will help guide how we move forward with our recommendations to the full council. Do we have anybody that wanted to comment on the 8 Can't Wait or any questions about 8 Can't Wait? Not seeing any. Just once again, Chief, very appreciative of your willingness to make changes that, I'll be honest, when we started, I didn't assume we were going to get to all 8. I just thought we could do better than where we were. I knew we could do better than where we were, but I am pleasantly surprised and very pleased that we've managed to check all of those boxes. And I know that's not the end of our work, but I think that it's a hell of a good start.
Mr. Eggleston, I just want to make a comment on that too.
Mayor Pro Tem, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And Chief, thank you for that hard work. I've looked at this website in the past before we even adopted 8 Can't Wait. And the cities that actually, the only cities that were closer to getting 8, I think San Francisco was the only one that had all 8. And most of them had been under consent decree, so they had to comply based on judicial orders. So the fact that we got there as a city that is not under consent decree and that the police department did that without being told to do that by a judge is just a real, testament to how hard you guys are working on that. So thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Also, before we move to the next agenda item, I do want to acknowledge that Councilmember Newton from District 5 has joined us here in CH14, and we are glad to have you, sir. If they could see you. All right, so without further ado, we will go back to Mr. Rios to tee up our conversation on CMPD directives on passive protest, peaceful demonstration, and First Amendment activities, which I believe will lead into our Community Input Group member and Civil Service Board Chair, Ryan McGill, presenting us with some of the feedback from that group.
Again, we began this conversation the last Community Input Group gathering. Ryan, along with Peter Weary and Kaz Otley, formed the document you see in front of you. This was a diligent effort, and in addition to that, as I mentioned, we had several members of the community, a few members of the Community Input Group provide additional documentation. So I will ask Ryan to present on the document that's before you, go into some of the additional pieces that Kaz Otley has added, and then I will do as quick a review as I possibly can on the items that were additionally shared. With that, Mr. McGill.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having us. First off, I believe all the additions and edits are on this page from Kaz Otley. And Federico, if you can help me with that to make sure. But in the subgroup on this topic, Reverend Peter Weary, myself, and Cass had put this together. Some discussion notes, you'll see that they are color-coded, one needing legal advice, and you'll see in the proposed changes throughout in the document what those work towards. Second, the robust communication plan to communicate rules of engagement with all parties, social contract, have a handbill to pass out to everyone on this site. This is one of the big things that we had highlighted as a need or a missing is before every protest there is an area where the protesters will meet, and we believe it was beneficial to have what we termed a social contract between the police department and the protesters, giving them an idea by handing them a handbill of what the expectations were from CMPD. So everyone was kind of on the same page and understood where the rules become peaceful and they transition to unpeaceful. So we wanted to see that there's we wanted to see more clarification of what would make a peaceful protest become unpeaceful. So with that, when we talked, we need to see a revision of the rules of engagement to include, and if you can read with it, ways to operationalize. Should be a policy in place that defines what's the criteria between peaceful and unpeaceful. So we thought, as an allowed, speech is protected, whether vile or loud, animated protesting, jumping, fist pumping, whatever is allowed. Police will respect people that are clearly marked as legal observers. So one of the agreements that the social contract would be that protesters have legal observers that are not participating in the protest, but observing from the sidelines and making sure that everything is on the up and up. That police would not arrest, harass, or assault any kind of these individuals, and that will affect their ability to kind of watch over things. Some of the prohibited items and things that we discussed that protesters should be adhered to is And what would make it a unconstitutional or unpeaceful protest is throwing projectiles, remaining certain distance from businesses. And that would be to part of the if you see on your discussion notes, is to provide the ordinance so that protesters are allowed to be within the street and not on the sidewalks closer to business. So we want to be able to, we thought that the group should, and CMPD should, protect businesses, and protesters should also respect the businesses in the areas that they're protesting. Protesters should not have firearms visible or concealed. And if they're endangering life or safety of other people, that is considered unpeaceful, and no fireworks. Proposed changes to consider. CMPD does not use chemical agents, crowd control weapons, OC spray, and CS gas. No flashbangs, grenades, rubber bullets. No kinetic impact projectiles of any kind due to their inaccuracy when fired from a distance. History of injury and history of injuring bystanders, and the ability to cause serious injuries and disabilities or sometimes death. Police body cameras must be worn and turned on at all times, especially during the protest. And we believe that CMPD has covered it, but with the uniforms that don't allow for wearing cameras, they need to purchase new equipment or uniforms to provide the use of body cameras at all times. Any officer that is not wearing or turning on their body cameras should be terminated and sent to the Civil Board for review. And this is what we've also, number 4, every engagement with citizens should be included on body camera footage. 5, should not seal identity of officer in charge of protests and should include footage. Officers must have on a badge and a visual nameplate. The next step we looked at is the renaming and redefining the roles of the officers during protests and demonstrations. The renaming, one of the things we had discussed is renaming police officers to peace officers and bringing it back to what their role is of serving the community versus policing a community, being more of a partner in that aspect. So during these protests, peaceful protests, we request that the officers not be wearing their riot gear or showing or permitting any military weapons as in long rifles. Those should be out of sight, out of view. Police should be wearing their basic uniform or plain clothes and walking with protesters, not providing a show of force by creating perimeters along the march routes. Again, no military type weapons, and officers should document violent or disruptive behavior prior to arrest. So utilizing cameras to say, look, to highlight the individuals who are being destructive, and then going in for the arrest. So the community sees that there is actionable, there is ability, the police have the right to go ahead and arrest these protesters. The last is, and this is, you'll see it needs legal advice, is a mechanism to encourage officers to speak out, stand up when things are wrong, duty to intervene during egregious acts. The group wanted to see some more skin in the game, and that would be that when an officer or when something wrong happens, the lawsuit goes towards the city, and the city ends up paying for the damages. We were looking at how can we tie civil lawsuits to the pension of officers. At that point, that would give officers who don't want to see their pensions touched or hurt in any way, that would give them more of an incentive to say, hey, don't do that, because it's going to affect me and my family. So those three big areas are what we discussed and what we thought we should pass on to you.
I know we've got a couple of questions. Mr. Rios looks like he might want to add something, but I want to clarify.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
What's that, Mr. Miguel?
There you go. Couldn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Hopefully can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So I appreciate that. Looks like Mr. Rios has something he wants to add. I want to ask Chief a couple of quick questions just to make sure I'm understanding certain things correctly, because I don't want us to spend any time asking questions about things that might or might not be relevant specifically for CMPD. It is my understanding, and I don't know if we've used them in the past, but it is my understanding CMPD does not currently utilize rubber bullets. Is that correct, Chief?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that's correct. We do not use rubber bullets on protest situations or crowd disbursement.
Is that to say that we do use them for some other purpose?
We have what's called a beanbag round that is used for, say, an individual has a knife that's threatening to either hurt himself or others that's I want to say passive in a situation where they're standing there, that we have that to use, but that's only authorized by our special weapons and tactics team that can use those during those types of standoffs. So
Okay.
Rubber bullets, no.
Assuming that you have the same slides in front of you that I have in front of me, are there any other things mentioned on here that maybe do not apply to CMPD? I know we had addressed previously the issue around the ability for any officer to have a body camera on their uniform. Has that been completely addressed at this point?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. Every member of our civil emergency unit now has the mechanism in place that they can put their body-worn camera on their uniform.
Okay. And that they all have the ability, no matter what gear they're in, to have visible badges and nameplates. Is that correct?
They have visible badges
and
with
ID numbers.
ID numbers, yeah, not the nameplates. And also another thing that was mentioned that is already covered by us is that any engagement with citizens during any civil unrest or protest, that the body-worn cameras will be turned on by all of our officers.
Okay. Mr. Rios, before we get to other questions, you looked like you had something you wanted to add there.
No, Mr. Chair, you let me know when you'd like me to add the other documents that were shared by other committee members, by other group members.
Since I imagine this is going to take up the large majority of our discussion time today, I think we're probably better served breaking this into segments. So since we have got this segment in front of us, let's talk about it before we move on to the next one. And I know Mr. Winston has had his hand up to ask a question. Mr. Winston?
Yes, I have concerns about the prohibition of or keeping certain distances away from businesses. That potentially criminalizes a very effective and important part of peaceful protests.
Mr. Winston, if you'll speak up just a bit, that would be helpful.
First time I've heard that from.
I know. I'm surprised. I'm as surprised as you are.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
So I was saying I have concerns about the prohibition or the distances between peaceful protests and businesses or physical buildings. I think Charlotte has a strong history with the sit-in movements that have been responsible for copious changes throughout American history. And the idea of criminalizing protests or confining it to a certain part of our city, I think we'll run into a lot of problems, and it constitutionally, and I don't think that is what this government should be doing. I have concerns about the way, obviously, we have a problem with firearms in general as it relates to Second Amendment rights and the legality of certain people to carry in certain situations. Would definitely like some more clarification as to how we think that can be enforced equitably. And with the topic of paying out lawsuits, I think it would be important to have an understanding of how much the city has paid out over time. So perhaps over the past 10 years, we can we can know about how much the city has paid out for police settlements. Good to have.
Chief.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope everyone's sitting down, but I do agree with Councilmember Winston on the fact of the businesses, because a completely lawful protest or march is required to be on a sidewalk, not in the street. So we have allowed for provisions during some of these protests to allow for protesters to be in the street, but to say that they can't be next to the businesses will take away that opportunity to put them on the sidewalks as they should be.
I think that makes sense. So, hold on, Mr. We've got somebody else in the queue. I didn't know if Mr. McGill wanted to respond to Mr. Winston's question before we go to Councilmember Johnson.
Yes, sir, Councilmember Winston. And I may have not added that, and it's not on the notes, but I don't believe it was to criminalize being in the business. It was more destruction towards business, which would make it unpeaceful protests.
So damage to the business, not proximity to the business.
Yes, sir.
Don't we already have laws on the books that?
Mr. Winston's question.
Sorry. Don't we already have laws on the books that protect property from being damaged, like breaking and entering and assault and other things like that?
Yes, sir. I think you do. I think this is just the community input group just re-emphasizing, hey, it's a social contract between the CMPD and the protesters themselves, just to highlight, hey, this is what we are expecting out of you.
Councilwoman Johnson?
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify the body-worn cameras. During our last meeting, there was discussion about the body-worn cameras being turned on at all times during the shift, or and unless there's lunch or personal time, and so that's on the table. So how does that relate to this proposed change?
I can let Mr. McGill or the chief speak to that. I think Mr. McGill was saying specifically that there would be a very explicit rule with penalties if it were not adhered to, that any interaction between any officer and any member of or any participant in a protest, if the body camera was not turned on, that would be expressly prohibited. Mr. McGill, do you want to clarify that, and then the chief can speak to it?
Yeah, that was the intent of that.
Yeah, and that's correct. And also with our policy now, as it states that we will have those body-worn cameras turned on at all times when engaged with protesters. So I think we cover that in this provision.
But the last meeting, we were talking about a change to the policy, and maybe another council member can help me here. We talked about, and I know you'll remember the discussion, Chief Jennings, because we talked about a minimum number of hours per day, or there'd be limited hours when they weren't turned on. So that discussion was on the table. So if we're looking at that policy overall, where officers would have their camera on all day or any time during their shift, then this specific language would fall under that, because their cameras would be on according to policy. So where are we with the other change? Was that a part of the group, Federico, or how does that fall in line with this?
Again, the members of the group put together their document. I don't know that they utilized the information from the previous Safe Communities Committee to do so. In reference, and again, Ryan may be able to speak more to this. My understanding was, as the chair has already shared, that their request is that body-worn cameras be on during any engagement with protesters. That, Ryan, if there's anything else you can elaborate on, I don't believe. I know you all have access to the Safe Community Committee meetings, but I don't know that you utilized any information from that meeting to create this document.
No, we did not.
Okay.
And Ms. Johnson, I do recall what you're referencing. I think the question was asked of the chief. I don't know that it went beyond sort of an inquiry from several of us about what sort of parameters do we have on how often the cameras are on or why they might be off. I think the chief responded to that. We can ask him to restate some of that response that he gave 2 weeks ago. I do recall that conversation, but I don't know that it went so far as a consideration that we make a policy that they be on for the entirety of a shift if they're not interacting with a citizen. But I'll look to the chief to restate what some of his thoughts were on that when we discussed it 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I did express concerns over having that policy as far as having officers leave their cameras on throughout the shift. I think myself and Councilmember Winston had had some conversation as well about the capacity and the ability to do that, which it would require a great deal of extra storage and funding to do that as well. But I truly feel that officers should not be expected to keep their cameras on continuously. It's a lot of times where you're going to be just simply driving in the vehicles. A lot of times you're going to have private conversations, things like that would not be prudent to record and store within our system. So I do recall the conversation, and I did express those concerns dealing with that.
Okay, thank you.
And Mr. Chair, may I add? So I'm reading the notes again. And, one of the things to revise the ordinance is to allow, one of our thoughts was to allow protesting in the streets as well as the from the sidewalks, to protect private property in some ways. So we did that. That was a note that was added to this.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. McGill. Mr. Newton, you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to comment on the conversation or the discussion before about firearms, distance from business, when I read this chart, I see on the far end of the chart there are proposed changes to consider, what I assume are recommendations, and then we have this factors for consideration in the middle that includes the firearms, the distance from business. I'm wondering now, that middle section doesn't appear to be a recommendation. That's just food for thought, right? So it's just something for us to kind of consider for future purposes, but it's not going to be coming before the committee or the council as a recommendation in its own right. And I think if that's the case, that's an important distinction to make here. It's something for us to think about, but it's not something that we're going to have to make a decision on. And when I look at that far right column, I'm not seeing a transfer over, at least of those 2 points on over. So just wanted to point that out. And correct me if I'm wrong on that, Mr.
Mr. McGill, I think that it's a fair question. How should we read the way that this is broken out? Should we propose changes to consider in the far right column? Should that be viewed as just as it's written, or should it be viewed as a recommendation? And if a recommendation, is it a recommendation from your subgroup or from the community input group as a whole?
So I think this document was, Sherry put this together to kind of keep everyone's ideas and thoughts in order. And the factors for consideration, I think, would be involved with the proposed changes. It's just the factors considerations, when you see that, is ideas that we're saying, hey, if we are going to label a protest peaceful and unpeaceful, what are those factors? So what would be prohibited to, what would change it from peaceful to a unpeaceful protest? When people start throwing projectiles, they're starting to distort businesses, they're getting close within businesses, they have firearms, endangering the lives and safety of others, throwing fireworks. It's all encompassing, I think, with the factors and proposed changes considered. We were just trying to get our thoughts out in a way that broke it out. But I would consider both the factors and the proposed changes all as one when you're making a decision.
And as options that you've considered or that you've come up with for us to consider, or as your, again, subgroup or entire group's recommendations to this committee?
I think it's to help you make your decision. Options for the council to decide on if they think it's a great idea, what and to add or subtract from.
Yeah. And Mr. Newton, I think,
So it's a mixture here.
Yeah.
I don't see, so when I look at the agenda, I'm not seeing an action item on this. So I'm assuming at some point in the future there will be an action item.
So you joined us a little late, but at the beginning of the meeting, no worries. At the beginning of the meeting, on September 29th, 2 weeks from today, we will be putting forward any and all recommendations that this committee wants council to consider at the strategy session on October 5th. So at that point, anything here or things that might not be in front of us could be considered by the committee to put forward as a recommendation to the full council.
And that will be input group and committee members?
Input group will get additional feedback from the input group on the 29th. I think you were here, we just discussed, they might even meet twice between now and then to make sure, to a question Ms. Ajmer had asked earlier, make sure we have the benefit of all of the community input group's feedback prior to this committee putting forward those recommendations to the council. But at that point, anything would be in order for consideration. And I think it is important to know whether the community input group is recommending these things they've got in front of us as opposed to just offering them as options. But the committee would be in order to consider these proposed changes or others.
Yeah, so it was my assumption that that was the recommendations on the far right side. Sounds like it's more of a mixture, and it means that this conversation we're having today is so much more valuable in that regard. So I hope that the group and council members take all of this under advisement consideration, particularly as it pertains to those items and everyone's opinions. So thank you for that clarification, Mr. McGill, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir. And I do think, though, it has made our meetings longer that most of council has joined us. I do think that it will benefit us come October as we start to consider the recommendations of this committee that so many of our other council colleagues, not on the committee, have been privy to the conversations we've had over the last few months. I think it will assist in making sure everybody's up to speed and able to properly consider and debate those recommendations that we might make. I'll remind all of my colleagues as they've asked their questions if they'll lower their hand so I can keep track of if anybody's queuing back up. I'm not seeing anything else, so we'll go to the next section with Mr. Rios and keep moving.
And just for clarity's sake, again, Ryan's group, Group 4, produced the document you see in front of you. There was additional documents that are in your packet that were sent by other community members, so members of the larger group that wanted to chime in on this particular topic. So I'll give, again, as quick an overview as I can of the three documents that are in front of me. The first one from Reverend Corinne Mack, president of the NAACP. Our rights are strongest in traditional public forums such as streets, sidewalks, and parks. We have protected rights to speak out on public property like plazas in front of government buildings as long as you don't block access to the building or interfering with the purpose the property was designed for. So these are the bullets that come up under that. Counter-protesters also have free speech rights. Police must treat protesters and counter-protesters equally. Police are permitted to keep antagonistic groups separated, but should allow them to be within sight and sound of one another. When you are lawfully present in any public space, you have the right to photograph anything in plain view including federal buildings and the police. On private property, the owner may set the rules related to photography or video. You don't need a permit to march in the streets or on sidewalks as long as marchers don't obstruct car or pedestrian traffic. If you don't have a permit, police officers can ask you to move to the side of the street or sidewalk to let others pass for safety reasons. When you can, write down everything you remember, including the officer's badge and patrol car numbers and agency they work for. CMPD hasn't had visible badges on lately. I believe the chief just addressed that in relation to those individuals that would go out to deal with protests. What should happen if police issue an order to disperse? Shutting down a protest through a dispersal order must be law enforcement's last resort. Police may not break up a gathering unless there's a clear and present danger of riot, disorder, interference with traffic, or other immediate threat to public safety. If officers issue a dispersal order, they must provide a reasonable opportunity to comply, including sufficient time and a clear, unobstructed exit path. Individuals must receive clear and detailed notice of a dispersal order, including how much time they have to disperse, the consequences of failing to disperse, and what clear exit route they can follow before they may be arrested or charged with any crime. In regards to the topic of taking pictures or shooting video at a protester, when you are lawfully present in any public space, when you have the right to photograph anything in plain view, including federal buildings and the police, this was mentioned earlier, police officers may not confiscate or demand to view your photographs or video without a warrant, nor may they delete data under any circumstances. However, they may order citizens to cease activities that are truly interfering with legitimate law enforcement operations. If you, I'm assuming as a protester, were videotaping, be aware that there is an important legal distinction between a visual photographic record, which is fully protected, and the audio portion of a videotape, which some states have tried to regulate under state wiretapping laws. I'm not privy as to what the state of North Carolina's rules are related to that. Protesters' rights when stopped by police: stay calm, make sure to keep hands visible, don't argue, resist, or obstruct police, don't run, live to tell your story. Ask if you are free to leave. If the officer says yes, calmly walk away. If you are under arrest, you have a right to ask why. Otherwise, say you wish to remain silent and ask for a lawyer. You have the right to make a phone call, and if you're calling a lawyer, police are not allowed to listen. You never have to consent to a search of yourself or your belongings. If you do not explicitly consent, it can affect you later in court. Police may pat down your clothing if they suspect you have a weapon and may search you after an arrest. And lastly, police officers may not confiscate or demand to view your photographs or video without a warrant, nor may they delete data under any circumstances. That was submitted again by Corinne Mack. I will briefly go over the solutions portion of Cindy Decker's piece, which deals with CCWs and CCIs. It is, well, before I start there, let me give a quick synopsis of some of what she shared here. The two main objectives she sees in relation to this discussion is identifying where there is a discrepancy of peaceful versus non-peaceful protests, and how to effectively manage and respond to the non-peaceful protests. The law does not prohibit certain restrictions on location and environmental circumstances, so this is what should be discussed moving forward, is what she has shared. Solutions and recommendations. It is reasonable to see out of the numerous categories and the potential medical impact of CCWs and CCIs. Again, these are chemical munitions. That the use of pepper balls is the safest strategy to disperse a crowd deemed unlawful or that have become violent. The one important caveat is that there must, emphasis on must, be proper training and understanding of the use of this tactic.
Mr. Rios, can you tell me where you are looking?
This is the document titled Analysis of All Documentation from the Subgroup and Chair of the CIG on Peaceful and Passive Protest, produced by Cindy Decker on September 15th. Do you have that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm on the back side of that document under the section titled Solutions and Recommendations.
Yes, sir.
All right. So the one important caveat is that there must be proper training and understanding of the use of this tactic. Based on the evidence of injuries sustained by PBs themselves, this is not happening across the nation and other nations. To their credit, the goal of the manufacturer states that it is an effective deterrent by creating a 12-foot cloud of irritant to eyes, nose, and throat of anyone in its radius. That is, in its description, should be sufficient and acceptable outcome to work with. The goal is to create a cloud. Focus and training on effective methods of deploying this product with that goal, avoiding direct impact of the projectile itself, is mission critical. If that is not the focus of the training, immediate correction should be adopted. If we were to decide today that all current forms of CCWs are wrong, unacceptable, and want to remove these tools from our LEOs, what are their suggested alternatives? This should be the starting place. Back to the beginning. The law is the primary objective in our need to remain a free and independent people and nation. If the laws are flawed, we have discourse. We need to be speaking to the lawmakers, not the law enforcers. Without this, there is very little opportunity for lasting change. To summarize, VIP questions, very important questions yet to be clarified for protesters, the public, and the police. What is the line between peaceful and non-peaceful? What are the rules for dispersing if they refuse? What are the safest products, tools, and tactics to be deployed? The last document I will briefly go over is actually short in and of itself. Robert Dawkins submitted this morning, so you all do not have this. And in fact, excellent. No, it's something different. So this particular document is just a quick overview of sections of policy that Robert feels tie back to the topic at hand. So looking at protest, not policy 600-014, passive protests and peaceful demonstrations. The function of the roadway primarily used for vehicular traffic, not allowing protesters there, should be reviewed. Conducting searches of structures, please review that entire directive. When it comes to First Amendment activities, there is a request to review number 2 under 600-015, which is CMPD employees shall not investigate, prosecute, retaliate, prevent, or hinder any person from lawfully participating in First Amendment activities. And number 6, which states that officers shall not confiscate or seize a participant or spectator's camera, cellular phone, or other electronic recording device simply because they are recording police activity. A camera, cellular phone, or other electronic recording device may be seized. So again, there's a desire to review that. Arbitrary profiling. So again, voluntary contact office may initiate a voluntary contact with a person as long as the motivation for the contact is not based on an arbitrary profile. He would also like consent to search 1, 2, and 3, which are just go over what has already been shared in some of these other documents. And again, a focus on body-worn camera and conducting vehicle searches. So I'll submit this to you, Chief. These are the areas that Mr. Dawkins has asked, and you all have the other documents at hand. That is what is submitted by the rest of the CIG group.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you for impactful recommendations. They all are. Presentation is great. But I wanted to ask, as far as drawing a line between peaceful versus non-peaceful, I've heard the chief mention a couple terms, and I want to know how those would apply. Imminent threat and active aggression. Because we've seen examples where it might look to us like because the protester's not violent, it would seem peaceful, but because of those terms or policies, imminent threat and active aggression, they were considered non-compliant. So can you tell me how those philosophies or those policies would fall in line with these recommendations?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So what we are, and there's been a lot of conversation about how we can identify a single, like people who are engaged in that activity when we are dealing with larger crowds. That's very difficult. And what we've been able to land on and what is actually by definition, when you look at righteous behavior, it just takes a group of 3 or more within, even regardless of the crowd size. So when you have a group of 3 or more and you have a crowd of 200 or 300, and then the officers are consistently getting assaulted and stuff thrown at them, then we have to make that determination. Are we able to make an arrest of individuals, but the entire crowd at that point is considered what we had talked about being actively aggressive towards our officers. So then we have to look at our tactics on how do we eliminate that threat or disperse the crowd. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but when we talked about active aggression, that's what it takes for us to determine whether a crowd is being actively aggressive towards the officers or damage to property, things like that.
So when I asked the question, I was speaking more of a smaller crowd, or if there's a protester that's standing too close, or what would cause a protester to be arrested or be pepper sprayed? When does it turn to active aggression from protesting?
Yeah, we've actually been dealing with that the last several days of some of the smaller protests that we've seen, and we've been able to go in and identify individuals and arrest those individuals where we have the resources to be able to do that. But if we're looking at any types of assaults, any type of aggression towards damaging property, any of that type of behavior is going to initiate a police response. So you've seen some of our biggest protests that we've had in demonstrations, up to 8,000 to 10,000 people, have resulted in no police action other than stopping vehicles for their safety to be able to march. So when you get to those crowds that begin to damage property or assault the officers or even each other within the crowd, that's when the police take a different action and stance towards what's going on with the protest.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Rios, is there another section of the presentation, or is that what we've got so far?
That is it for the group in relation to past programs.
And for council's review, can you, Mayor Pro Tem? I didn't see your hand, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I have a question with regards to other protests, Chief. Thinking, especially when we're talking about the smaller protests in front of the women's reproductive health clinics. I think we hear that one group of protesters are treated differently than the other group of protesters. Would you anticipate that there will be changes at some of those events as well, based on these new recommendations?
I think you cut out a little bit. I don't know if I caught everything, but I think you were asking if there will be any changes on, say, the abortion clinic type protest where two groups, are there any changes related to that and dealing with that with police?
At the reproductive health clinics, yes. When they come in without permits, they just did that Saturday. They didn't have a permit, they had hundreds of people, and there just seems to be sometimes, I hate to say a double standard because both sides break the rules, but do you anticipate anything will change in those situations?
I think we've always tried to work with both sides, and we've tried to always remain unbiased in our response and to make sure that there is a buffer between both sides of the issue. At times we've been very successful at doing this, and we have at Police Headquarters Jessica Battle, if you'd like to go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I'll wait a couple of moments so our slide presentation can get up so that you all can follow along. All right, thank you so much. We'll get started in talking about our transparency and access to information. We will go over the laws that govern release of certain information, and then we'll talk about information that CMPD does make available. Next slide, please. As a background, North Carolina law dictates what is a public record, and basically all documents, books, letters, papers, photographs, recordings, even as far down as if you keep up with the technological times, things that go on social media from the city would all become part of a public record as it relates to the Public Records Act. So generally, everything is public from the government. There are some exceptions. We have attorney-client privileged communications and trial preparation materials. That comes from the sort of legal rules of process and procedure that go along with those sorts of things, as it would any attorney-client communications or work product and trial preparation, even in the private setting. Those are just throughout the country based on the laws in every state and the bar and rules of ethics. Those are things that are private, whether it's from a private entity or public. Then we have certain criminal investigative and intelligence records that is going to be private, including and not limited to autopsy photos, videos, audios, and official reports. That's why a lot of times when persons request a police report from the CMPD, they would get the public portion of the report and not the full confidential report. That's based on a number of factors, including public records laws, victims' privacy laws, and certain things that cannot be disclosed in that manner. On sometimes we might release criminal investigative materials if there's a protective order. That often happens if there's some civil litigation going on. Let's say there was a homicide in Charlotte, and on the civil side, not the criminal, but on the civil side, maybe civil attorneys are also involved in a wrongful death lawsuit based on that criminal homicide. Those attorneys might request the report so they can use it for their civil litigation. In instances like those, what we often do is have the court enter a protective order that this particular file, this criminal investigative file, can be used for litigation, but not for public information. And that would allow us to release certain non-public information to attorneys in those aspects. And then on, we have emergency response plans and public security plans. That comes from General Statute 132-1.7 in talking about sensitive security information, other sorts of things that would not be private, obviously to protect emergency responses or any organized gang investigations or things like that that might be going on, or particular special weapons tactics and such like that. Personnel records is our next bullet point. That's the big one. That's the one we often get requests for. It's governed by General Statute 160A. That's 160, capital letter A, -168. And we'll get more into what is and is not public in that statute in a couple of slides. Next, we have body-worn camera and other law enforcement agency recordings. That is governed by General Statute 132-1.4a. And so as we know, the body-worn camera and other recordings are not public. Persons have to file a petition with civil superior court as outlined in the statute. From there, a judge would review the videos in camera or prior to a hearing. Once the CMPD, any officers or the petitioners, a bunch of parties, whoever is an interested party, will appear before the court to be heard, and the judge would therefore decide what is or is not going to be released out of that body-worn camera petition. I know you often hear us say body-worn camera petition, but it also covers surveillance cameras that would be on CMPD property. It covers our traffic cameras here at CMPD, and it's any sort of custodial agency recording that is created, maintained, or housed by the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. The next would be our alarm registration information, which would not be public, as obviously it relates to more private entities and those sorts of things. Next slide, please. So when we talk about information made available by CMPD, there are a number of different things. We have our annual reports, 911 calls, and radio traffic. Specifically with 911 calls, we cannot give out identifying information, and so that is redacted, and voices, the sound of the voices are altered as well in regard with that. Citizens review reports, financial reports can go out, advisory committees. We do our internal affairs annual report every year, which we'll get more into detail about. Crime stats, 21st century policing reports, our directives, officers' records are also available in a limited capacity. And the limited capacity as it relates to officers' records, or what we'll generally call personnel records, comes again out of that 160A. 168. So when we talk about that statute, we'll go back just again, I'm sorry. It will, to get deeper into that statute, the certain things that are permitted to be released out of an officer's records would include their name, their title, their current position, their salary, and their age. We can also include dates of employment, increases or decreases in salary, general information on promotions, demotions, transfers, suspensions, separations, or other changes in position. Another one, we can release the date and type of each dismissal, suspension, or demotion. When we talk about that, that's specifically section B11 in the 160A statute. When we release information about the date and types of dismissals, suspensions, or demotions, obviously that oftentimes comes from internal affairs. And that's something where we cannot release the entire report itself. We cannot release the actual written complaint, whether it be internal or external. We couldn't release those write-ups. Those are considered protected personnel information, but we can release the result or the summary at the end. So we could release that the person was cited for a violation and that they were cited for termination, or they got 20 hours of suspension, those sorts of things. And then lastly, we can also release the current office to which the officer is assigned, so their current actual assignment, as it talks about limited release of officers' records. We can do next slide, please. When we look at our internal affairs annual report, there are a number of things we release, and the big deal is that CMPD cannot effectively serve the public without having the trust of the public. So our IA process plays a big role in that, in maintaining and building public trust. Since about 2003, the IA Internal Affairs Report has been part of the CMPD's goal to remain transparent and be proactive in releasing certain information that is lawfully able to be released from our internal affairs standpoint. The men and women of CMPD are committed to providing the best service possible, but obviously are still humans, and sometimes things do need to be internally investigated. But we investigate those matters thoroughly, and we publish what we can in the annual report in order to make sure we maintain a high level of confidence in the community, because the objective is that we want the community to better understand the seriousness with which we take these internal investigations, that it's not something we just check boxes and go through the motions, but that it is thoroughly investigated. It's brought before a board to be heard. That board communicates and renders a disposition or decision as to whether or not the officer violated the complaint or whether or not they did not. That board would then also determine the sort of disposition or disciplinary action, whether it be suspension, demotion, or termination. And so we want people to really understand the processes we follow when looking into when an employee uses force, when they're involved in a motor vehicle crash, if they are injured or accused of misconduct. And so the Internal Affairs Report is an overview of the activities, and it presents a similar data comparison data as to the year before. That annual report would include, as you see on the slide, community oversight, disciplinary actions, investigations involving officers and sometimes non-sworn employees as well. Those matters are heard by Internal Affairs as well. Use of force reports, in custody deaths, our vehicle pursuits, and employee vehicle collisions would all be included. That data would all be part of that annual report that is published each year, again with comparison data to the year before. Next slide, please. When we look at our 2019 Internal Affairs reports, you see some stats in front of you. About approximately 70% of all of our complaints, whether they are internally generated by another employee sending that matter to Internal Affairs, or whether it's an external complaint, about 70% of those matters are sustained against officers. And that just shows we do hold ourselves accountable as an agency, and again, don't just go through the motions, but we actually investigate those and do 70% of the time have sustained violation. About 73% of our neglect of duty violations, again, internal and external complaints, are sustained. 56% of use of force matters are sustained. That could range from a physical use of force, meaning hands only, or that could go all the way up to an officer-involved fatality or non-fatality shooting. About 50% of our arrest, search, and seizure complaints are also sustained. Again, all of this data is about internal and external complaints. And so when you look at all of those numbers overall, the part to be good about is that when we talk about rule of conduct violations, they've actually decreased by 6.4%. I think that's a result of us holding officers and employees accountable. And as you see in those numbers, we do take those investigations seriously. Next slide, please. When we look at these sort of investigative information services that are available, information that we put out, we have our crime mapping system where you can look at crime numbers in certain areas. Also Crime Stoppers, we use that as a tool to put out certain information so that members of the community can help CMPD investigate crimes that they might have information that occurred in their neighborhood or wherever else. We certainly do that and put out that information. We also have put out data on firearms by felons or possession of firearm by felon, missing persons. Our Project Lifesaver, we're part of that movement or that group. It's a rapid response for persons who might have a tendency to get lost or wander off, specifically Alzheimer's, dementia, or other sort of mental health diagnoses that might cause people to need that sort of rapid response for the elderly or especially anyone else with some sort of mental incapacity that's going on and affecting them. Also homicide, open investigations. We put out information on that, again, not only to just inform our public about crimes that are occurring and what we are doing, but also in hopes to receive information back to help with the investigative process and the later prosecution of crimes. We have a cold case unit that is investigating crimes from years and years ago. As it stands in North Carolina, there is no statute of limitations or there is no time frame limit on when we can on how long we can investigate or prosecute a felony. And so we do have our cold case unit that could, for example, be looking into a sexual assault that occurred 15 years ago. And we certainly can put out information on that, again, in hopes of receiving information back to help with the process. We have an open data source. And then with our officer-involved shootings, we also put out a lot of information there as well about what happened, where it happened. And when certain portions of the investigation are released, we can put out more factual information about the officers involved. Of course, we would notify families before the decedent's name was released and those sorts of things. And then obviously, the more the internal and external investigations of an officer-involved shooting goes along, the more information that can be released. I know the public may have noticed the public may have noticed that some information as it relates to officer-involved shootings. Can we mute for a moment? I'm sorry, I think we're getting some feedback. Can we hear me now? Yep. Okay. Continuing on in the information and data put out about officer-involved shootings, last year when it was determined that the State Bureau of Investigation would look in or investigate all officer-involved shootings, that does somewhat limit the information that CMPD might be able to put out initially as being the non-investigating agency. And so that's something where we still want to be transparent, want to work with the community in putting that information out to maintain that public trust, but that timeline has sort of changed a little bit because we do have to wait for certain steps of the external investigation by the SBI to occur, and we might not be privy to all of the relevant facts right away. So those are examples of the information that we are putting out. Next slide, please. And the next slide would just be the question slide. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to jump in and I can certainly answer.
Yes, this is Julie Eisold. I have a
Mayor
question
Pro Tem, I'll call on you.
about the internal investigation.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
I've got you up second if you don't mind.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Yep.
Mr. Winston had his hand up first and then the Mayor Pro Tem.
Mayor Pro Tem can go first.
What a gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Winston. I have a question about the internal investigations. If a citizen has a complaint against an officer interaction, and they end up filing an internal investigation, what is the follow-up with that individual? You mentioned how these are reported in the annual report, but is there a reasonable time frame within which CMPD gets back to the person that filed the complaint and gives them any kind of indication of what the actions were that were taken, that kind of thing? Is there a level of expectation by the person that's filed the complaint?
Yes, Mayor Pro Tem, thank you for that question. There is a level and an expectation that the external citizen will get a statement of relevant facts, or what we call a SORF, S-O-R-F, that would outline any relevant facts in the adjudication of the matter, so they are made aware of the disposition. They are not present at the hearing. They do not receive all of the substantive evidence that is spoken about at the hearing, but in addition to filing the complaint, that person would speak with an internal affairs sergeant about the complaint and have a sort of interview process so that we can understand the full factual side of the facts. Then the hearing process takes place, and then from there, they would be notified via the SOAR for the relevant facts as to the outcome of the matter.
Okay, and did they give them an indication in the beginning of what a reasonable period of time is? Or, I know every case would be different, but is there sort of a standard that you ask them to uphold in terms of what a reasonable amount of time is to respond?
There's not a certain date that we put on it because, as you somewhat stated, it is going to be dependent on the facts. It would depend on how many officers were involved and how many officers would need to be spoken to, or whether any additional civilian witnesses might be involved as well. And so all of that, that amount of people involved and the number of people who would need to be interviewed can take some time. And then obviously, depending on the particular offense, it could take longer. As you can imagine, an internal affairs investigation for an officer-involved shooting versus, I don't want to say something smaller, but something not as severe as an officer-involved shooting, like maybe a traffic stop courtesy violation where a citizen might allege that an officer maybe used a curse word. That might take a lesser amount of time than an officer-involved shooting. And so those are discussions that would take place by the internal affairs sergeant when they are speaking with the citizen complainant to kind of give them the larger expectations of the timeline. But we don't want to tie ourselves into any specific timeline because that traffic stop where a curse word was used could turn into a larger investigation depending on what facts could come out. So we just have those discussion on general expectations of us contacting the civilian as soon as possible after the investigation. And certainly civilians are, they do and can reach out to internal affairs, if they do have questions about the timeline for a status update.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilmember Winston.
Thank you. Does state law define all the materials that are not public record on that list that you provided?
So was that the initial list that I went through?
Yes, materials not public.
They're not public. And so for the ones that are listed, the attorney-client communications and trial prep, those just come from the rules of process and evidence and things that relate to lawyers. So that's what that comes from. When we look at public security plans, that would be from General Statute 132-1.7 that covers sensitive security information. The personnel records, that would be under General Statute 160, capital letter A, 168. And then our body worn camera statute is General Statute 132-1.4, capital letter A. And so within each of those, it says that the information in those particular statutes is not public, to answer the question.
And of course, attorney-client information, a client could determine that they don't want that information to be privileged anymore and make that public at a point in time, correct?
Generally speaking, yes, the client does somewhat, I don't want to say hold the reins, but does have a big input as to what is confidential. For example, if even in the private setting or personal, if an attorney were to be speaking with their client and they have a non-client in the room, then that would be a non-privileged conversation because there's no expectation of confidentiality as there's a third party in the room. Similarly, if the client themselves were to go tell a third party, that information would no longer be privileged as well.
So your client, you're the attorney, your client is CMPD, correct?
Correct.
CMPD does get to determine what information it should be privileged within this relationship or not, and as well as us on City Council. Is that correct?
Well, I would say, as it relates to CMPD, generally speaking, there aren't discussions as to, this is a privileged conversation. It's more of if I were to send an email to the deputy chiefs about a particular, with particular advice on a legal matter, that would be privileged if we were to get a request for it. Obviously, there are certain things that might come out later in public releases as it might relate to a civil matter or a criminal matter. And at that point, it would no longer be privileged. But there is not like an active discussion as to, quote, will we keep this confidential and privileged or will we not? But generally speaking, conversations that I would have with the chief of police in advising and how to handle certain legal matters would be privileged, if that answers the question.
Is there an objective bar? Because we ran into this during the Danquarius Franklin case, where CMPD was receiving advice from the lawyer that City Council and the city attorney and the city manager were not aware of, but it was just compartmentalized because of this attorney-client privilege to not, for instance, turn over certain information to the courts. So do we have an objective bar that determines where that, within our organization, or ethically or whatever, where that attorney-client privilege begins and ends?
I guess certain information would be discussed within CMPD, and then, I often discuss things with Mr. Baker. Those matters are sometimes discussed with City Council in that sort of way, and so that it's not a literal thing where each and everything CMPD and its attorneys discuss are literally privileged for every single word that is uttered. As far as, I believe you're talking about the body-worn camera request as it relates to Mr. Franklin. When that happened, that was an internal discussion of reviewing the statute and reviewing the petition for the videos. And based on what that particular petition asked for at that time, there were internal CMPD discussions as to what videos should be considered respondent to that. However, I can say, as it sits now, and as was seen at the big body-worn camera hearing we had on September 4th, all videos go over. So those discussions aren't even the same as they once were, as it is now our policy, if we have a body-worn camera request, to send over each and every video from that instance and give the court the universe so that the court can determine what's relevant and responsive to that matter.
Yeah, well, I guess the body-worn camera part was just an example. When we talk about this trust, this public trust, there's a concern that some determinants that have wide gray areas, like attorney-client privilege, can be abused, and we don't know. We, including the City Council, don't know what that bar is. So we don't know the questions to ask. We don't know the information that we're not getting that could be potentially relevant to keeping that community trust.
Well, so let me expound a little bit, maybe this will help. And so when we talk about, like, factually speaking, what facts are discussed at CMPD and released, that is going to rely more on the public public record statute, whether it's criminal investigative and those sorts of things. Other things when we talk about like strategy for court, trial, potential litigation, that's going to be more on the privilege side, but that does at some point come before council as the governing body to discuss litigation, those sorts of things. But there is some level of trial strategy, attorney work product to prepare for court. Those are the things that would remain confidential. To kind of draw a line in the sand, I guess.
Yeah, it's tough, I guess, but that's why we're here doing the work. As it relates to these IA complaints, I know this is something that Chief Putney was always a big fan of putting out there and utilizing. But in these numbers that you are providing, is this all of the complaints that come in, or is this just one that is deemed credible or chosen to investigate? And following up on that, has and this is another question that's come from the community, how are we kind of putting our analysis on the efficacy of the IA process? Is this something that we're just judging internally, or have we had an outside kind of independent group come in and say that kind of put a qualitative analysis on our processes?
So the statistics and percentages from that slide about the 2019 internal affairs claims, that's for everything. That's the overall universe of those complaints. I can say, you kind of touched on it. Some internal affairs matters are handled at a division level as opposed to the full hearing process, and it just depends on the type of particular complaint. Sometimes they are handled by the captain of that particular division, but that would still be considered a formal complaint and is put in with all of our numbers. As far as a third-party investigation, I am not aware that we have ever had a third-party sort of audit on our internal affairs process. I can say, generally speaking, IA is just a very confidential part of our operations, and I'm not aware, but Chief Jennings, jump in if you're aware that we've ever done that. I don't think we've ever done that.
Kalia. Yeah, I do know that Internal Affairs CALEA, our accreditation, is part of that as well. But I believe, and I'm going to find out here in just a minute, that there's also an accreditation for Internal Affairs. But if I'm incorrect on that, I'll let you know in just a minute. So,
thanks, Chief.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
Councilwoman Johnson.
Thank you. I just wanted to know about the internal investigation process. If a complaint is not considered credible or doesn't rise to the level of chosen to investigate, is the complainant sent a letter? And are any of them, I mean, credible and, well, I guess just a non-credible, are they advised of the appeal process?
So I don't want to say that a complaint is not credible. What we would look into to see whether it was unfounded, as in maybe it didn't occur at all. And we do get complaints like that where citizens might complain about something. And when we looked, we determined, that particular officer wasn't even in the area at the time. That person would be given an adjudication as to the determination of that particular matter and can certainly appeal from there if they so choose. But I don't want to say that anything that might on its face seem, quote, incredible is not investigated. It would be investigated to determine, was an officer in the area? Did the officer interact with that person? Or maybe it was an officer from a different agency. We would do that level of investigation to determine what, if anything, happened. And if we determine that this is from a civilian who maybe was mistaken or, interacted with a different agency, we would certainly give them a report saying that, the matters in your complaint are unfounded, but they could potentially appeal that.
So are they advised in writing, and in the written documentation is the appeal process outlined?
No, I don't believe that's outlined, and not in the SORF in any way. I can say from the attorney standpoint, if which sometimes happens if persons were to contact my office to say, you know, what can I do about this? What we would advise is, you know, you have certain appeal rights. You should speak with a private attorney to help you with that if you need further information, just because as an agency and even as a law office, we cannot provide legal advice, and telling people step by step what to do in that realm would be giving them legal advice. And so they are generally aware of the appeals process, but that's not an in-depth discussion where we give them any sort of, you know, handout or anything on how that goes.
So, what is the appeal process? Aren't residents eligible to appeal to the CRB?
I'm sorry, you cut out for a moment.
Is the CRB the appeal process for the internal investigation?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
So that's a process, not necessarily legal advice, right? Is that something we could consider advising residents that the CRB is the appeal process? Because I don't know that everyone would know that.
We can advise generally that that's the appeal body that would handle that matter, but we could not just step by step give directions on how to do that process. We can just give general advising that this Citizens Review Board, is the appeal body, and from there they would have to determine via themselves or a private attorney or looking at the charter and the city ordinances as to how that process actually takes place step by step.
So when we talk about transparency and building trust, I think that and accountability, I think that that's something to consider. I mean, if you didn't do anything wrong, you didn't do anything wrong at the IA level or the CRB level or the court level. So I think that advising residents that this is a public right and the city does have this process for them to adjudicate. It would be my thought that would build public trust, that if you disagree, these are the appeal steps or these are your rights.
And so that information, somewhat of what you're saying, because the CRB is an independent body, completely independent than CMPD, it's run through the clerk's office. That's where they can get that information from the clerk's website as to what the CRB does. But again, that's not something as, CMPD being independent of that process and us not being able to specifically go line by line as to what to do from our end. They could go to the city clerk's website for some more information, and so it would be publicly available there that the CRB is the body for it to properly hear the appeal.
When you're saying that you can't, I think Ms. Johnson, at least what I'm hearing her ask, when you're saying you can't, is it because you are the quote-unquote opposing counsel in a legal matter and you cannot advise the other side of that legal matter?
Correct. If it comes to my office, yes, absolutely. Right. I cannot give them advice as to how to handle that legal matter. And so that's why, let's say specifically it comes to the police attorney's office, as sometimes it does, we would advise, they can look on the city website, look at the charter, or speak with a private attorney to actually learn more about the process itself, who to contact, what to do, the timing, the deadlines, and those sorts of things.
So I think what Ms. Johnson's getting at is maybe not for you to address, but maybe for the manager, which is, can the city, it makes sense why the CMPD attorney can't advise the opposing party in a legal matter, but the city could provide information that helped shepherd folks through that process. Is that kind of what you were getting at, Ms. Johnson?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. If CMPD is not able to do it, then something for the city manager or as the city, then that's a great idea to coordinate and provide the link.
If I can jump in, and we can get you that exact process, but we do provide information about how citizens can appeal to CRB along with the adjudication. And then also to clarify, our CALEA accreditation is the only oversight for our internal affairs. I believe that was Councilman Winston that had asked that question, but I will get you the exact way that we inform citizens of how they can appeal to CRB, but they are given that information so that it's available to them to make an appeal if they so choose to do so.
Mr. Chair, I like what you said, though. Mr. Jones, is that an option that the city could have a page or get involved to shepherd that process?
Yes, we'll do that.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Councilwoman Ajmera.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to follow up on some of the questioning by Ms. Johnson and Mr. Winston. So when there is an independent, or not independent, but when there is an internal investigation that's being done after the complaint has been received, do you all disclose the outcome, and who do you disclose it to?
So as we kind of talked about before, the statement of relevant facts or the SORF, that's something that will go to the complainant. And from there, our internal affairs informs the district attorney's office of all adjudications. At that point, we are not sending the DAs a full write-up. They don't get the investigative file itself or anything, but we do send that information over to the DA's office as part of the Giglio process and the Brady processes that they are required to follow. And so those are the two bodies from there. I guess further on that, if we were to receive a public records request about anything, we could release what is allowable in 160A-168. Again, promotions, demotions, suspensions, and those sort of things. But if it were a public records request, we would not be releasing the facts in that same manner. And so I guess the three ways are: the complainant would get a copy of the relevant facts, the DA's office gets just a very brief summary that an officer may have been adjudicated, and then have a sustained complaint, I should say, and then from there, a public records request, which would get the limited information per 160A.
So can you elaborate on if there is a public records request, what would be in our response, and what information we would not be able to disclose? I'm not clear on that.
So if we go back to the 160A slide, we don't have to literally pull up that slide, but we could give the officer's name, their title, their current position. We could talk about the date of the adjudication, whether it resulted in dismissal from the department, suspension, or the dismissal or demotion of them as the disciplinary action. We could not, for the public records request, give the facts or circumstances. We couldn't say, for example, on September 1st, Officer Jessica Battle is alleged to have committed a courtesy violation during a traffic stop with all the facts. That part would remain confidential, but what that public records response could say is Jessica Battle was given a suspension of 20 hours on September 1st, 2020, to kind of give an example of how that would look.
Okay. Another question I have is on the use of force reports. Can we release the use of force reports?
That's not something that is released either. That's part of the internal affairs investigation of sorts. And so let's say we were to get a public records request for the police report and the internal affairs report on a use of force. What the person requesting would get would be the public police report version, and then they would get, again, the 160A internal affairs, like the name and the particular disciplinary action, like suspension and number of hours. But the full report, no, would not go out.
So are we able to release officers' past history of any violations?
If that's something where we were to get a request, if someone were to say, I want to see Officer Jessica Battle's full complaint status, we would basically just do one big summary and have Officer Jessica Battle's name and then have the date, suspended on this date, suspended again on this date, demoted on this date, and that sort of brief summary per 160A, but even then, it would not have the full report summary of any sustained violations throughout the employment. Just again, that sort of line by line, the date and the suspension, the title, the pay, those sorts of things.
Got it. So going back to the use of force reports, is that something where you need council's approval, or is this the state law that does not allow us to release any sort of use of force reports?
So for the use of force reports for CMPD as the custodial body, we are limited by 160A-168. If someone were to request it from us, the literal CMPD agency, we are limited. That's not something we would go to council for permission for or request. It would be a particular person requested from CMPD, and CMPD is bound by these particular statutes, whether it's the criminal investigative or sensitive security information, whatever it may be, we are bound by that. If they were to request the documents specifically from council, then council would be governed in that way accordingly. Council, in conjunction with the city manager, if they deem in writing that particular documents are necessary to relief for transparency, compelling government interest, other sorts of things, that's something that's done independent of CMPD. I would say the statute is probably written intentionally that way so that there is that sort of checks and balance. So to summarize that answer, if the information is requested specifically from CMPD, we are bound by the relevant statute, whether it's personnel, sensitive security information, etc. But if someone were to request from council and the city manager, they would be governed by separate statutes and could release according to those statutes.
I understand. Okay, so ultimately, if the request is made to the council and manager, then council and manager will have a discussion on that, and that's governed by a different statute, and in that case, the use of force reports could be released if council and manager was to agree to it.
Yes, they'd have to list in writing the compelling reasons for such a release. And please forgive me, if we hadn't brought it up, I would be able to remember that specific sub number, but I can't remember it. But yes, they'd have to, that would be in conjunction with those two bodies. It would have to be a formal writing that they would have to write the reasons for that release. And again, that's independent of CMPD. It would be for the request from those bodies.
This was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, not seeing any other hands at the moment. I want to transition to, I think the more we can make sure we're on the same page of what we want to accomplish on the 29th and what our expectations are from staff for the 29th, I think the better equipped we'll be to work efficiently and effectively on the 29th. So one of the things that I would ask of Mr. Rios is, one, as you determine with the community input group the viability of meeting each of the next 2 weeks between now and the Safe Community Committee's next meeting on the 29th at 11 a.m., if you'll keep the Safe Community Committee members abreast of that decision, what will be covered, and I think it would be helpful in the way that we had Mr. McGill here today, if we have the ability on the 29th to hopefully have someone from each of the subgroups of the community input group, even if there's not necessarily a presentation for them to make, but have them available to answer questions from council members as we weigh potential policy change recommendations that we would put forward to the full council. I can imagine that we might want either a refresher or a clarification on the discussions that they had, similar to some of the questions that Mr. Newton, for instance, asked Mr. McGill today, to clarify some of the language in the feedback that they provided us. So whether, I don't know if there were, quote unquote, leaders of each subgroup, if there are and they could be available, or if not, if someone from each subgroup could be available, so that as we cover each of those subject matters, we have somebody that we can turn to with questions or clarifications as needed. I think that would be helpful. Does that seem doable?
Absolutely. I will, again, speak to the subgroup, probably by email this afternoon, just to share with them the request from the Safe Communities Committee meeting for them to meet twice. But I will ensure that we've all spoken at Thursday's meeting about meeting again the following week.
Okay, and I want to turn to the manager here momentarily to have him discuss the next steps as he sees them. Again, for the public's understanding, on the 29th, the committee will make recommendations. Those recommendations will be put forward to council at the October 5th strategy session. A week later, which I suppose would be the 12th, that would come before a city council business meeting for a public forum where anyone in the public could comment on those recommendations and their support or opposition to them. 2 weeks thereafter, on October 26th, we would be taking a vote, presumably, as a full council on those recommendations. So that's the timeline. I would encourage, too, for our committee members that if you've got things over the next 2 weeks as you're weighing and discussing with your colleagues what might be potential policy recommendations that we would make as a committee, that if there are some, particularly if there are questions that might require some information gathering or some research by staff, that we try to be very proactive about getting those to staff so they have the time to do that. For us to try to ask some of those maybe heavier lift questions in real time on the 29th, I think will bog us down pretty severely. So I think we want to save as much time on the 29th, not for information gathering, but for being able to kind of debate and weigh the merits of whatever proposals we might discuss amongst ourselves as committee members. So anything we can do to get that information, get those questions asked, and keep fellow committee members up to speed on that in advance, I think is helpful. Mr. Manager, what other input do you have as it relates to us moving forward from here?
I believe, Mr. Chair, you stole all of my lines. But with that said, I do believe that Chief Jennings wants to clarify one issue that came up earlier.
Please.
Yes, just for clarification, the statement of relevant facts that goes out after law enforcement, after the internal hearing, it does have the information that on how to appeal to the Citizens Review Board, and it gives a phone number as well to be able, and they have 30 days after they receive that statement of relevant facts to issue that appeal to the Citizens Review Board.
That's for all cases, the ones that are sustained and non-sustained or non-credible. That's for all complaints.
Those are cases that are reviewable by the Citizens Review Board. All cases, all complaints are not reviewable by the Citizens Review Board. I think we went over that list during the last meeting, and we did add neglect of duty to be one of those as well. So any what we call any Citizens Review Board reviewable complaint is listed when they get that information that they can they are given information on how they can appeal.
Did you have an additional question on that, Ms. Johnson, or does that answer your question?
I'll get clarification because I want to make sure you understand. So if I, as a citizen, file a complaint to Internal Affairs, and Internal Affairs finds that it's not credible and won't be investigated, I get a letter that says we've reviewed your complaint. There's no evidence to move forward. However, you have an appeal right with CRB. Does that happen?
That's correct. When you get the statement of relevant facts, that will be included on how to appeal with CRB. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. And this might answer some of Ms. Johnson's questions, but we made revisions to the Citizens Review Board a couple years ago, and it might be helpful to review those changes in that next meeting. But in particular, one of the things that we said was that when a citizen gets that letter from CMPD saying that they have the right to go to the Citizens Review Board for an appeal, we're supposed to offer them an advocate from the Community Relations Committee that will help them fill out that form. just on a neutral basis. That was one of the revisions that we had a couple years ago. I don't remember exactly when it was, 2015, 2016. So it would be good to know if that's happening, if that has been put into practice on a regular basis when citizens get that letter from CMPD.
Mr. Manager, is that a question we can answer on the fly here, or can you come back to us with that?
I received a text also, so I'll follow up with Willie to make sure that that's occurring.
Anything else, Mayor Pro Tem?
That's it. Thanks.
And I'm trying to determine if, no, okay. So it looks like we're all set there. As always, I appreciate everybody's time, and I think we're going to have a very full plate 2 weeks from now. But I think we're in a good position to take all the information that we have been provided and all the questions that we have asked and compile that into something that is a meaningful and effective set of recommendations to put forward to the council. So I'll look forward to that. Godspeed to our colleagues who have to go straight from this into a budget committee meeting shortly. And I'll look to my vice chair for the magical motion.
A motion to adjourn.
All right. Without any objection, we shall, and we will talk again soon. Thank you, everybody.